Okay, welcome again to everybody. Today our guest is Jana Mynářová, is the director of the Institute of Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University. The title of her talk is Writing on the Edge, Cuneiform Traditions in the Western Peripheries. Jana, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being with us.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sergio. I'm not sure, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
But now I can't see mine. That's the problem. We've tried before, so I apologize. But can you see the presentation or can you see the presenter's mode?
No, I see the presentation. No, yeah, the presentation I'm seeing.
Okay, but it's not moving. So apologize for this. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the mess. So first of all, Sergio, Franco, thank you very much for your kind invitation. And Friday evening. So welcome everybody, all the brave souls who are out there, especially like on both European and also the US side. So just let me start. At the core of this series, talks like question regarding Mesopotamia versus Greater Mesopotamia. And today I would like to, still I have some technical issues here. Don't know why. So again. Okay, it's better now. So today I'd like to take you to the westernmost part of the region where cuneiform writing was used, namely the Levant, and also to some extent Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC. The Amarna letters are often considered the epitome of cuneiform culture in the Western Peripheries. This perception mainly arises from their significant testimonial value concerning the political, social, and cultural dynamics of the region during the latter part of the 2nd millennium BC. However, these letters are not the exclusive documents of this nature originating from the Levant. So therefore, in this talk, I will look at the Amarna correspondence within a broader cuneiform context, with particular attention to the correlation between Levantine written sources and the temple and/or palace economy. But first, let me start right in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. So we'll start with Mesopotamia, going to the Greater Mesopotamia. At the very end of the 4th millennium BC. Starting in the Uruk period, the temple played an important role in the life of Mesopotamian society and its economy. As a center of production, it became one of its great organizations, as identified by Leo Oppenheim, and it retained its essential role as one of the key economic units throughout the duration of the Mesopotamian civilization down to the 1st millennium BC. Temple administrative records provide us with a great deal of detailed information about the functioning of these institutions, although their distribution over time and space is very uneven. Thus, we have very detailed information for some periods and regions, but must rely on other types of sources to understand the economic functioning of temples in other periods and regions. Such regions also include the southern Levant at the end of the middle and early phases of the Late Bronze Age. That means in the mid-2nd millennium BC. As a region, the Levant is very far from being a monolithic and indivisible political, cultural, or linguistic entity. In respect to its socio-economic milieu, it is characterized by a complex mixture of elements stemming from local traditions, but enriched by external sources, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, which gradually took root in the region. To understand the long-term processes shaping the economic and administrative reality in the region, we must, to a large extent, overcome the limitations of traditional periodization. Instead of archaeological periodization, which would divide the entire period under discussion into smaller segments, we thus create a larger time unit, the common element of which is the use of cuneiform writing as a fundamental tool of official communication and, to a certain degree, administrative practices. Chronologically, we can define this period as the time between the introduction of cuneiform administrative practices and their replacement by another administrative tool, namely Egyptian hieratic. Thus, even the documents from later in the period will be viewed through the prism of cuneiform environment, which also applies to one of the most extensive subsets of documents, the so-called Amarna letters. But already in the Chalcolithic period, roughly 4,500 to 3,600 BC, both extramural, such as in Ein Gedi and Gilad, and intramural, such as Shekmim or Tel El Rasul, sites designated for ritual practices are attested in the Levantine region. However, their role and function within the socio-economic framework at that time is not completely clear. The same can be said of the very character of the socio-economic organizational complexity in the region, on which there is no general consensus. It also applies to problems related to the social hierarchy itself. Although the presence of a social elite operating cultic and ritual activities is unquestionable, the specific scope, role, and extent of their activities and tasks are a matter of scholarly debates. There is, however, no doubt that massive socio-political changes that began to take place in the southern Levant with the very onset of the early Bronze Age around 3600 were also reflected in its economic infrastructure. The gradual transformation of small villages into regional centers and the accompanying changes in settlement distribution represented a new element not only in the material culture, but also in the overall functioning and diversity of local communities. The continuity with the previous period is represented by the existence of open shrines and sanctuaries during the early Bronze Age, which were soon replaced by the more complex constructions of temple compounds in the early Bronze 1B. During the early Bronze 2 and early Bronze 3, both temples and palaces can be identified in the region. The importance of the temple role in the largely urbanized and stratified society living in fortified settlements is well reflected in the prominent position of EB3 large monumental structures at sites such as Megiddo, Zerachun, Ai, or Arad. Although our knowledge of the cultic practices of the time is largely derived from elements of the material culture, including offering deposits or the architecture of individual smaller and larger structures, their economic functioning and the role in society are far from clear. The progressive urbanization accompanied by an intensification of settlement, population growth, and intensification of agriculture and craft production, and the participation of the trade network in the southern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age, so roughly first half of the second millennium BC, also had far-reaching consequences in the context of the development of temple institutions. Although some of the constructions show links to external traditions, especially Syro-Mesopotamian traditions, and the site of Hatzor is a prime example, others clearly reflect local development, mirroring distinct conditions and needs that took shape during this period. It is this combination of external effects with continuous local developments that can be considered the main characteristics of this period in the southern Levant. In the early phase of this period, large public buildings, usually identified as palaces, were built in several places throughout the southern Levant, and we can especially look at the sites such as Afek, Megiddo, Tel Kabri, Tel Ifshar, Tel El-Ajul, or Lachish, and subsequently played a key role in the economy and administration of the area, concentrating considerable centralized political power and resources in their hands. The fact that it was the palace that was the main centralizing economic unit is also evidenced by contemporary cuneiform sources, and I will come to this in a minute, with Hatzor being the main gateway through which exogenous northern traditions, both the material culture and administrative tools such as cuneiform writing, entered the southern Levant. Among other cultural and socio-political changes which took place in the Levant during the first half of the second millennium BC, the introduction of cuneiform writing in written records occupies a prominent position. This phenomenon is closely associated with the intensification in the use of trade networks that developed hand in hand with the growth of long-distance contacts. The cuneiform writing, together with relevant vocabulary, had come a long way from Mesopotamia via Syria before being introduced to the southern parts of the Levant. It's from the Middle Bronze Age onwards that we can witness the active use of this communication tool by the local elites. The process, however, is more complex as it involves much more than a mere introduction of a new writing system. At the same time, it also represents a close encounter with social and economic concepts and structures that may differ considerably from local traditions. And I refer particularly to the introduction of economic and social realities reflected in the employed terminology, which represent new and distinct elements that had been formed in a different time and space and echo very different concepts. Although the Middle Bronze Age dossier of written records is very limited, it currently counts less than 24 cuneiform texts and short inscriptions, including inscriptions on cylinder seals, we can still distinguish two geographically based groups. Into the first one, we can include texts that were written down in the northern areas of the Levant, where the cuneiform tradition was more richly documented already in earlier periods, but which, however, were found at the sites in the southern Levant. The second group is represented by the text and inscriptions that were actually both composed and found in the southern Levant, and thus testify to the very existence of the local use of cuneiform script. Such use of cuneiform writing in the southern Levant thus represents a type of hybrid tradition in which a foreign phenomenon designed to record data was employed to record different realities which undoubtedly represented the very core of the local socio-economic environment. The key question is how exactly the foreign, that is, Mesopotamian terms used in these texts reflect the local realities. As the present talk focuses primarily on the evidence provided by cuneiform sources, it will focus mainly on the period when cuneiform was actively used for administrative purposes, that means from the latter part of the Middle Bronze Age until the late 14th century BC. Since the later stages of the Late Bronze Age, there is a significant decline in the use of cuneiform documents to record the administrative and economic realities of the southern Levant. Documents dated to the 13th and 12th century BC will not be discussed in this talk. Geographically, the discussion focuses on an area whose maximum extent corresponds to the maximum range of the Levantine Amarna letters. That is, it reaches the area of Nukhasha and Ugarit in the north, while it is limited by the Gaza Strip in the south. In terms of geography, the Amarna letters were chosen as a defining sample because it is the largest collection of written sources dated to the above-mentioned period and representing one of the most significant pillars for further discussion. Thus, in addition to documents from the Middle Bronze Age southern Levant, the corpus also consists of Late Bronze Age texts from Tanakh, Kumidi, Katna, and Tel el-Amarna, as well as documents from Beth Sha'an, Gezer, Hatzor, Tel el-Chessi, Jericho, Jerusalem, Megiddo, and Shechem. The chronological distribution of the text is uneven, but the vast majority of these can be dated to the mid-14th century BC. With respect to the find context of the majority of these texts, we can conclude that it is often known, and when it is known, it often refers to a palace or a palace-related milieu and not a temple, But in some cases, however, it's also possible to infer the palace-based or royal-based context from the content of the document itself, such as Gezer 1 or Hatzor 5. However, from an archaeological point of view, the reliable identification of a building as a temple or a palace is not always entirely unambiguous. As I have already mentioned, the Middle Bronze Age corpus of cuneiform texts is very limited in its number, and this is especially true of texts that have a potentially crucial value for understanding the principles and instruments used by local economies. That especially holds for administrative, but also epistolary documents. Currently, there are not even 10 such texts, with the majority coming from a single site of Hatzor. With the exception of maybe one, none of these texts, however, can be without any doubt connected either to temple economy or temple-related excavation context. And only 3 documents provide more details on the economic reality in the southern Levant. These are a pair of texts from Hatzor related to property rights, Hatzor 5 and 15, and an administrative text from Hebron, referred to as Hebron 1. As for Hatzor 5 and 15, both documents provide information on property rights, and while the text of Hatzor 5 is a court report, Hatzor 15 is a small and very damaged fragment of a letter whose sender and addressee cannot be identified. However, none of these texts can be related to the economic functioning of large institutions, that means either a palace or a temple, and their testimonial value in this respect is therefore negligible. Well, as for Hebron 1, it is also a short and very damaged text in a tabular format that may indirectly refer to an economic transaction in which both the ruler and the temple could have participated. The text mentions presumably a local ruler together with several individuals, identified only by their personal names without titles or even personal determinatives. These are apparently involved in an unspecified transaction with domesticated herd animals, including 77 sheep for offerings. Unfortunately, the text is very corrupted, so the individual details of the transaction cannot be reliably identified, but it is the mention of animals for sacrifice that indirectly makes this text a possible link between the palace and the temple. At the same time, however, the mention of female tax collectors in line 4 of the reverse makes it an important document related to local economic reality and specifically to tax collection. In its masculine form, the Akkadian term mushadinu is attested exclusively in Old Babylonian texts. The terminology thus indicates that the document may be associated with the Old Babylonian scribal tradition, but in the realm of cuneiform periphery. This does not automatically mean that it was actually written in the Old Babylonian period. The lack of mimation in this text, which applies also outside personal names, might suggest that the text could be of a later days, probably a late Old Babylonian or even later. The term appears both in official and private contexts, with its role determined based on the Edict of Amisaduqa and other Old Babylonian documents. Mushadinu's activities are often associated with a collection of specific taxes, Igisu tax or Nemetu tax, and are related to the palace. Harris, for the evidence from Sipar, suggests that Mushadinu may have been an official sent from Babylon and responsible for collecting taxes for the palace. Both Igisu tax and Nemetu tax were royal taxes paid annually, with Igisu paid in silver and Nemetu tax paid in kind, often in animals or their products, lambs, goat hair, barley, vegetables, etc. The Sipar tax provide evidence that also merchants paid both taxes. As the text Hebron 1 refers to female tax collectors, together with several animals, It provides us with the indirect evidence that this might be an administrative record regarding the nemetu tax paid in kind, in this case livestock, to the palace. In official documents from the Old Babylonian period, Mushadinus activities are associated with the palace. As there is no indication or any direct connection with the economic functioning of the Mesopotamian temples, it is unlikely that it would have been otherwise in the then southern Levant. It is true that the overall number of cuneiform documents originating in the southern Levant in the Middle Bronze Age is at present very limited, and it would therefore be too speculative to draw any significant conclusions from this fragmentary testimony. On the other hand, the only text that has some measure of the necessary information, that means Hebron 1, may actually indicate more about the economic functioning of a palace institution rather than a temple. The number and repertoire of cuneiform written sources from the southern Levant dated to the late Bronze Age are considerably richer than those from the earlier period, although they share a number of common elements with the older corpus. For the late Bronze Age cuneiform texts hold that the largest set is represented by the documents of Levantine origin from the Amarna archive. These texts usually represent the main axis and core for discussion concerning political and administrative traditions of the said region in the second half of the second millennium BC. The evidence is occasionally supplemented by other cuneiform sources, including those from Katna, Kamit Elos, Ta'anech, Hathor, Jerusalem, Megiddo, and Shechem. Despite the fact that this is a significantly larger group, it is still relatively limited, comprising of no more than a few hundred documents, many of which are in a fragmentary state. From a typological point of view, letters can predominate among them, although documents from Katna include mainly administrative texts, as well as inventories and legal documents. The world of the divine is for the most part represented only through the names of the individual gods, who are mentioned especially in the form of invocations to protect the life, health, and well-being of the letter addressee, or to punish those who disobey an order. However, the temple institutions themselves are mentioned only very rarely and in very isolated cases. This almost complete absence of references to temple institutions and their functioning is something that even these much more numerous assemblages of cuneiform texts from the late Bronze Age southern Levant can link to the evidence suggested by written sources from the earlier period. No such references are found in the text from Kumidi or other South Levantine cuneiform documents from this period. The situation is somewhat different in the case of Katna, where although we don't have a specific temple structure directly mentioned in the written sources, we have extensive inventories containing various objects intended for the goddess Nin Egal and the gods of the king. The only real references to temple structures are thus found in the Amarna correspondence. However, even in this case, the explanatory value of the cuneiform text about the economic functioning of these institutions is very limited. In the entire Levantine set of Amarna letters, consisting of almost 300 documents, we find only 3 direct references to temple buildings. All of those references are associated with the correspondence of Ribhada, the ruler of Byblos. In letter EA 74, addressed by Ribhada to the Egyptian king, he extensively quotes the words of Abdi Ashirta. I quote, "Don't be negligent to your servant. See, the hostility of the Apura troops against me is severe. And as the gods of your land are alive, our sons and our daughters are gone, as well as the wood of our houses have been sold in the land of Yarimuta for provisions to preserve our mere lives. For lack of a cultivator, my field is like a wife without a husband. All my troops that are in the mountains or along the seashore have joined the Epirus troops. Only the city of Gubla, Byblos, and 2 other towns are left to me. And now Abdi Ashirta has taken the town of Shigata for himself and said to the man of the town of Amiya, kill your man, and then you will become like one of us. And you will be at peace. And they have been won over following his words. And now they are like the Epirus troops. So now Abdi Ashirta has written to the troops, assemble at the temple of Ninurta, and then let us fall upon the city of Gubla. Look, there is no one who will save it from our hands. And then let us drive out the mayors from the lands, so that all the lands will join the Epirus troops. May an alliance is made for all the lands, so our sons and daughters will be at peace forever. And if the king should come forth, and all the lands will be against him, then what can he do to us? Thus they have made an alliance among themselves, and thus I'm very, very much afraid, since there is no one who can save me from their hands. Like a bird in a cage, so I am in the city of Gubla. Why have you neglected your country? Thus I have written to the palace, but my words are not heeded. End of quote. The text thus specifically mentions the temple of the war deity, identified here as Dingir Ninurta, and determined. The context suggests that he must have been in an area that was at this time under the control of Abdi Ashirta of Amur. Following Naaman and Artsi, we may understand the divine protagonist as a syncretic form of Mesopotamian Ninurta and local Anat, reflecting the closely related social political changes in the region of Amur at the time. However, the unspecified temple of Anat Ninurta is not chosen by Abdi Ashirta at random, but instead of its economic role and functioning. We learn from the text about its political significance. Slightly more information on the economic functioning of the Levantine temples is provided by 2 other texts. In both cases, there is no doubt that the institution or institutions in question were located directly on the territory of the city, that means Byblos. Ribcheda writes to the king of Egypt, I quote, "And may my lord know that I will die for him. When I was in the city, I guarded it for my lord, and my heart was dedicated to the king my lord. I did not give the city to the sons of Abdi Ashirta. Accordingly, my brother turned the city into an enemy and handed it over to the sons of Abdi Ashirta. May the king my lord not neglect the city. There is very much of silver and gold in it. There is also much property that belongs to the temple of its gods. If the king my lord sees it, let him do his servant whatever he will. May he give the city of Burusilim for my dwelling." End of quote. And then we can actually continue with another letter, E109. "And now they are hostile to me, and they seized 12 of my men. They bound them in their prison, and they set the ransom price between us as 50 shekels of silver. And I took from the temple of the lady of the city of Gubla, and I ransomed the 12 men." Both these letters, E837 and E809, are typical examples of Ribcheda's correspondence. They are full of urgent pleas for help, descriptions of the difficult situation in which the ruler of Byblos finds himself, and at the same time, eloquent emphasis on his loyalty to the Egyptian king. At the same time, however, E837, so the first of the 2 mentioned texts, mentions something that we don't encounter in other texts. And this is not only true of the Ribcheda's letters. In order to emphasize the importance of his person, the sender resorts to yet another step, and that is to stress the economic importance not only of the city itself, that is, of the palace and the ruler possessed, but also of the considerable wealth to be found in the city temple, silver and gold. So here, for the first time, we encounter the temple as a separate economic unit from the economy of the palace. Also in letter E809, the main cause of Ribhada's troubles is the hostile activities of the descendants of Abdi Ashirta and their allies, who, according to his description, are already in full control of all the main centers in the area, hitherto loyal to the Egyptian king, and threaten Ribhada's security. They have even captured several of his men and are holding them captive, leaving Ribhada with no choice but to ransom them from this captivity. While this passage is badly damaged, the surviving fragments indicate that Ribhada obtained the means to pay their ransom at a temple, presumably that of the Lady of Byblos. As is evident from the overview, references to existence of functioning of temples are very limited role as those who are guarding the city and the place of the king. A similar request is well attested in several letters from Egypt. Rainey then sees the designation city and place in these letters as two separate entities, with place of the king understood as a term for a temple or similar religious structure. This combination of elements, that is, place and city, or in reverse order, is attested in 4 letters in the Amarna correspondence, and the senders of these letters are Pu Baalu of Yursa, Yidia of Ashkelon, and Shipti Baalu of Lachish. In at least 3 of these 4 cases, the letters were sent by rulers of geographically close cities, Yursa and Ashkelon, and their geographical affinity is confirmed by petrological analysis of the material used. The 4th text from Shipti Baalu of Lachish, although not petrologically analyzed, also shows on visual inspection features of tablets written in southern coastal plain and the Shefela. The fact that we can consider all these texts as belonging to a single group is also confirmed by paleographic analysis. In his study on the paleography of the Amarna Canaanite texts, Juan Pablo Vita convincingly proves that the scribe of EA 315 is actually identical to the scribe of EA 325. And also that there are such similarities between 2 other scribes of Ashkelon and the scribe of letter EA 323, which is the Ashkelon scribe number 1. So basically, this is quite possible that they were in fact one and the same person. In the case of the 4th one, letter 331, the determination of its place of origin is problematic, as it has not been petrologically analyzed. However, from a paleographic point of view, it shows a number of features in which it coincides with the letters mentioned just now, and it is not possible to exclude the possibility that the letter was also written by the very same scribe of Ashkelon. I mentioned earlier that the affirmation of the local rulers that they would follow the commands of the Egyptian king and guard the palace entrusted to them by the king is found in other texts as well. In these texts, however, it is exclusively the place or places of the king, both singular plural forms are attested, and not both place and city. Therefore, the senders of these letters literally respond to invariable appeal of the king, which is well preserved in 3 letters from Egypt. That is, I quote, "Guard, may you be on guard in the place of the king that is with you," end of quote. In none of these commands, however, does the double element place and city occurs. And therefore, it is highly probable, also in view of the polographic analysis of the above-mentioned text, that the dyadic expression can be just identified as a typical element used by a single scribe of Ashkelon letters, which in case does not reflect the duality of the institutions of the local ruler is supposed to guard, that is, the city and the local temple. If we believe Ribchada that he could have used funds that came from the temple property to pay the ransom for his men, then such a claim provides a new perspective on the functioning of the temple and palace economy in his city. Ribchada was a very prolific author, and the collection of his letters numbers some 60 documents. Explicit references to the actual existence of any temple structure, however, are found only in those 3 letters which I've already mentioned. And the temple as an economic unit is mentioned only in 2 of them. Considering other details he goes into his correspondence, this is relatively surprising. Nor do other Amarna letters from the Levant provide any insight into the existence and economic functioning of the Levantine temples, and references to possible temples referred to by Anson Rainey proves to be erroneous. However, it can hardly be assumed that this absence of mentions of temples in cuneiform written sources could be due to the absence of such temple buildings at the sites mentioned in the Amarna correspondence. Archaeological evidence speaks against such a claim. The explanation for this absence must therefore be sought in something other than the absence of the buildings themselves. Cuneiform texts from the Middle and Late Bronze Age point to a common tradition. That means a tradition related to the palace economy. And it is therefore logical that direct references to the economic functioning of temples do not appear in these documents. The explanatory value of cuneiform texts for understanding the economic functioning of the temples of this period is thus very limited, and for this purpose, we must turn to other types of sources. The cuneiform texts from the Levant serve as an invaluable source of information, not only about the political history of the region, but also about its economic functioning. As we follow the spread of cuneiform writing from its original centers in Mesopotamia to its peripheries in the course of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, we can also observe the spread of economic thinking, realized through a series of underlying administrative elements and procedures such as taxation and resource management. From this point of view, the Levant during the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, distant in time and space from the cuneiform heartland of Mesopotamia, must be considered the actual periphery of the cuneiform peripheries. During this period, fundamental political changes took place in the southern Levant, when the Egyptian state and the interest of its rulers in the economic and political control of this area began to play an increasingly important role. It is common that in parallel with the growing agency of the Egyptian state over the Levant, much attention is paid to the influence of Egypt on the political and economic organization of this region. However, the extent, intensity, and chronology of Egyptian activities in the Levant are still subject to extensive discussion. A new set of radiocarbon dates from the southern Levant has been published recently, triggering a wave of new interest in these questions, highlighting especially the problems of chronology and absolute dating. In a series of recently published contributions, the consequences of the new radiocarbon-based dates for the southern Levantine sites, moving the end of the Middle Bronze Age so far back that it precedes the start of the New Kingdom, have been discussed thoroughly both from the perspective of Egyptian traditional official narratives, focusing on the scarcity of contemporary sources for the southern Levant, and from the perspective of archaeology. In her stimulating contribution, Katharina Streit in 2019 offers a crucial revision of the archaeological evidence testifying to the presence of Egyptian individuals in the southern Levant throughout the Late Bronze Age. Her research is based on a series of analyses of material culture identified as objects that, I quote, embody cultural automatism, end of quote. Or in other words, objects produced without an intention to imitate foreign, in this case, Egyptian models or ideas. Distinct architectural types, building methods, and materials, burials in anthropomorphic clay coffins, hieratic inscriptions, and Egyptianizing ceramic assemblage are discussed in detail to reach representative conclusions. Also drawing on the analysis of Egyptian and Egyptianizing pottery by Mario Martin from 2011, she reaches clear conclusions that the presence of the Egyptians in the Levant in the early phases of Late Bronze Age was very limited, while the Late Bronze Age 2B strata, dated from the 13th to the early 12th centuries BC, witness an immense increase in Egyptian and Egyptianizing elements in the material culture. The chronological definition of the studied corpus of texts by the onset and implementation of a new administrative tradition, that is, the use of Egyptian hieratic, thus has clear support in the archaeological material. During the 13th century BC, the Egyptians gained control of the southern Levantine region. Consequently, they put in place tools suitable for the Egyptian administration. From this moment on, the cuneiform tradition plays no role in the administration of the southern Levant, and the final stage of the Late Bronze Age is therefore outside the cuneiform borders of this talk. In the northern Levant, the chronological scheme is somewhat different. Here, cuneiform writing keeps its fundamental position in administrative practices, even in the latter phase of the Late Bronze Age, as shown, for example, by the text from Kadesh or Ugarit. And, as in the case of archaeological material, it is impossible to set up a clear chronological boundary between the two traditions. In this regard, however, we must keep in mind the existence of fluid, transitional, or in other words, hybrid phases in both parts of the Levant, in which elements of individual traditions are mixed and new traditions are actually gradually formed. The earlier phases thus correspond to a period with no permanent or semi-permanent presence of Egyptian administrative structures in the southern Levant. During this stage, contacts between the Levant and Egypt are primarily realized through interregional trade and eventually military expeditions. These contacts are documented for both the southern and the northern parts of the Levant. The conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Mitanni after the military campaigns in year 9 of Amenhotep II at the end of the 15th century can be considered as the beginning of a new transitional phase in the southern Levant. As a result of this treaty, most of the Levantine rulers entered the Egyptian sphere of interest. It is the Amarna letters, however, that testify to the extent of such a transitional phase in the southern Levant. Although these were written at a time when the influence of Egypt over some regions of the Levant was already quite obvious, the traditional medium of a cuneiform clay tablet was still used for administrative purposes, at least in its written form. Instead of introducing a completely new system, unknown and unattested in the given region, the Egyptian administration thus adapted to the traditional communication scheme, with which it took over the basics of a functioning economic system. The certain dependence of Egypt on existing structures is also shown by the almost complete absence of Egyptian administrative terms in the form of lexical borrowings and the Amarna letters. which is especially true when it comes to taxation and management of resources. In economic or economy-based, economy-related texts of the Middle Bronze Age Levant, livestock often appears next to grain, plant, or wooden products, people, weapons, and estates. A very similar picture of the economic reality of the Southern Levant is provided by later sources as well. In slightly earlier documents from Ta'anek dated to the 15th century, personal, agricultural products, and weapons actually play an important role. In their letters, addressed to the Egyptian king in the middle 14th century BC, the local rulers confirmed that everything is prepared or under preparation. But the context shows that the individual commodities are intended to be used on the spot by incoming military troops and not to be transported to Egypt. Probably because the repertoire of these commodities is considered so standard, the local rulers do not even specify the individual items in their letters and are content with a laconic statement that everything is ready, regardless of the purpose of the arrival of the troops. The fact that these items do not differ significantly from the products documented in this region in older texts is reflected in the lists of items enumerated in 2 letters from Ashkelon. In EA 324, Yediyah of Ashkelon lists the respective commodities as bread, beer, oil, grain, oxen, small cattle. And these items are largely repeated in another letter, 325, as bread, beer, oxen, small cattle, grain, and straw. In both cases, the lists may be repetitions of the list of requirements expressed in a letter from the Egyptian king to the ruler of Ashkelon, a letter like EA 370, for example, in which, unfortunately, the relevant passage of the text is not preserved. However, the obligation to material provide for the newcomers was clearly not limited to military units, as evidenced in letter 226. In this letter, a certain Shipturi something explains that he is preparing everything necessary, oil, bread, and beer, for the arrival of king's caravan. Local rulers often refer to the orders of the Egyptian king they carry out. In letter 337, however, the relevant order is quoted in extensor, which also allows us to identify the term used for this type of supply. Prepare the supplies before the arrival of the archers of the king, my lord, followed by the confirmation. I have prepared great supplies before the arrival of the great archers of the king, my lord. The Levantine region in the 2nd millennium BC represents the most remote area of cuneiform tradition or traditions. It is indeed a kind of periphery of peripheries. The surviving sources from the southern Levant, the absolute majority of which are letters, do not provide us with a coherent narrative on economic reality in the region. But on the other hand, they do provide limited insight into the terminology related to it, allowing us to better understand the local economic, political, and/or social situation. The resulting economic system, which can be observed in the southern Levant in the Amarna period, thus represents a kind of a hybrid structure. It is clear that the Egyptian interest in some parts of the region was of economic nature. At the same time, however, it's also evident that the Egyptian administration did not come to the empty land and had to respond to an existing and already functioning structures. The Amarna letters showed that in order to ensure control over the local resources, the royal administration seamlessly followed these structures and procedures using the traditional terminology. Only after consolidating control over the region did it take the next step, which was to use its own writing system that better met the needs of the Egyptian apparatus. Thank you very much for your attention.